April 14, 1945. A German woman pressed her back against the truck wall and closed her eyes. Her name was Elsa Richter. She was 24 years old. She had survived Allied firebombing that turned Dresden into a crematorium. She had watched 25,000 people burn alive in a single night. She had pulled bodies from rubble with her bare hands. She was a telephone operator, not a soldier. She never fired a single shot. But she wore a German uniform, and now the truck was slowing down. The gates were opening. She heard the other women breathing fast around her, 63 women total. Nurses, radio operators, Signal Corps auxiliaries, most under 30, a few barely 18. Their commanding officer had told them exactly what to expect before capture. Americans torture prisoners. Americans starve enemies. Americans take revenge. The propaganda had been specific, detailed, designed to terrify. And it worked. Every woman on that truck believed she was riding toward suffering. What none of them could possibly know was that within the next 8 weeks, the thing they feared most would not be the guards, not the barbed wire, not the interrogation rooms. It would be a plate of pink, wet, impossibly salty meat that would shatter everything they thought they knew about their enemy. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is just getting started, and you don't want to be left behind. 63 German women walked into an American prison camp expecting death. What they found instead changed their lives forever. By the time they left, they weren't asking for freedom. They were asking for seconds. This is that story. And it begins not with a battle, not with a general, not with a treaty. It begins with a cook from Texas named Harold Brennan and a pot of boiling corned beef that was about to start a war no historian ever wrote about. Stay with me, because the next 20 minutes will change how you think about enemy's food and what it really means to defeat someone. Germany in the spring of 1945 was losing everything. The Eastern Front had collapsed under Soviet pressure. American and British forces were pushing through the West. Cities burned daily. Supply lines were severed. The Nazi war machine, once the most feared military force on Earth, was grinding itself to pieces against the reality it had refused to see coming. WWII. But inside Germany, the propaganda never stopped. Joseph Goebbels' machine ran at full speed even as the buildings crumbled. Every broadcast, every poster, every officer's speech carried the same message. The Allies were monsters. Americans were barbarians, hiding behind industrial wealth. Surrender meant death, or something far worse. The German civilian population, including the women who served in auxiliary military roles, believed it completely. They had no reason not to. It was all they had ever been told. German women in the Wehrmacht auxiliary served in critical support roles. They operated communications equipment, maintained records, ran telephone exchanges behind front lines, performed medical duties. They were essential. They were also trapped. When Allied forces overran their positions in early 1945, tens of thousands of these women became prisoners of war almost overnight. They had nowhere to run. The army they supported had disintegrated around them. American military command faced an unexpected logistical challenge. They had planned extensively for male prisoners of war. The camps were built for men. The procedures were written for men. But suddenly they had thousands of German women in custody, and the military had to figure out what to do with them quickly, carefully, and correctly. Then the Geneva Convention was clear. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely. They must receive adequate food, shelter, medical care. They must not be abused or humiliated. American military command took these rules seriously, not just for moral reasons, but for strategic ones. How America treated German prisoners would be watched by the entire world. It would influence post-war diplomacy. It would shape the peace that followed the fighting. So the camps were organized. The procedures were standardized. And when 63 German women arrived at a converted factory complex in Louisiana in April 1945, the system was ready for them. What the system was not ready for was the cultural collision that was about to happen inside the mess hall. Elsa Richter grew up in Dresden, the most beautiful city in Germany. Before the war, Dresden was famous for its Baroque architecture, its opera house, its art museums. Her father was a clockmaker. Her mother taught piano lessons. They lived in a small apartment above her father's shop. The smell of her childhood was machine oil and fresh bread and river water from the Elbe. She was 18 when the war began. By 20, she was working for the Military Communications Corps, operating telephone switchboards that connected Wehrmacht units across the Eastern Front. She was careful, precise, fast. She learned to stay calm when the calls carried screaming voices. She learned to disconnect lines without emotion when units stopped answering. She did her job. She believed she was serving her country. By 24, her country was ash. The Dresden she grew up in had been bombed into rubble during 2 nights in February 1945. The firestorms killed tens of thousands. The death toll is still debated by historians, but what is not debated is what survivors saw. A city of culture and art turned into a landscape of skeletal walls and charred bodies. Elsa survived because she was stationed east of the city when the bombs fell. She returned to find her father's shop, destroyed, her home gone. Her mother evacuated somewhere unknown. She kept working. What else could she do? 2 months later, American forces surrounded her position, and she was taken prisoner without a single shot being fired. She handed over her identification papers, sat down on a wooden chair in a tent, and answered questions from a translator she could barely understand. Then she was put on a truck with 62 other women and driven south. She didn't know where Louisiana was. She didn't know what corned beef was. She didn't know that a large, good-natured cook from a town outside San Antonio was about to accidentally become one of the most significant people she would ever meet. Harold Brennan was 26 years old and had been cooking for the Army for 3 years. Before the Army, he cooked at a roadside diner outside Corpus Christi, where his specialties were chicken fried steak, jalapeno cornbread, and a chili that regulars drove 40 miles to eat. He had no military ambitions. He wanted to go home and open his own restaurant. But there was a war, and the Army needed cooks, and Brennan was one of the best they had. He was assigned to POW Camp Food Service because he was reliable, because he didn't complain, and because his food waste numbers were the lowest in his division. He ran his mess hall the same way he ran a restaurant kitchen. Clean, organized, consistent. Food went out hot. Portions were correct. Nothing was wasted that didn't have to be. When he received word that 63 German women were arriving, he did what he always did. He checked his inventory, confirmed his menu, and started cooking. The menu for that Tuesday evening was standard military issue. Corned beef, boiled cabbage, mashed potatoes, white bread. Same thing American soldiers ate across thousands of bases. Nothing special, nothing cruel, just food. He didn't speak German. He had never met a German person in his life. He had no idea what German food tasted like or how German women felt about salt. None of that occurred to him as he sliced the corned beef into thick portions and laid them on the serving trays. He was just doing his job. He was just feeding people. When the women filed into his mess hall for the first time, he noticed their eyes. They were scanning everything. The ceiling, the exits, the guards standing near the walls, the other women around them. They moved like people expecting to be hit. Their shoulders were raised. Their steps were small and careful. They sat down at the metal tables without speaking. Brennan carried out the first trays personally. Wow. The corned beef sat in the center of each tray, pinkish red, glistening slightly from the brine, a thick slab about the size of a man's hand. It smelled powerfully of salt and cured meat, a smell that hit the nose like a wave before you were anywhere near the table. American soldiers loved that smell. It meant a hot meal. It meant you were somewhere safe enough to sit down and eat. To Elsa Richter, sitting at the end of the second table, it smelled like nothing she had ever encountered in her life. Germany had its own traditions of preserved meat, and they were completely different. German preservation was smoke and thyme and regional craft. A butcher's smoking technique was passed down like a family heirloom. Bavarian white sausage, Thuringian bratwurst, Black Forest smoked ham. These were not just foods, they were identities. Every region had its specialty. Every family had its recipe. Salt was used in German cooking, but carefully in balance as one element among many. Here, what sat on Elsa's tray was an entirely different tradition. American corned beef came from Irish immigrants in New York in the 1800s. They needed cheap meat that would last without refrigeration. Jewish butchers in Lower Manhattan sold them beef brisket at prices they could afford, and the Irish preserved it in massive barrels of coarse rock salt, the same coarse kernels they called corns, which gave the dish its name. The meat sat in brine for weeks. The salt penetrated every fiber. It changed the color, the texture, the taste. It turned the beef pink all the way through, not the pink of rare meat, but the uniform deep pink of something chemically transformed. By 1945, the U.S. Army had turned corned beef into a logistical weapon. It was cheap. It was durable. It could survive shipping across oceans. It required minimal preparation. Soldiers hated it and ate it anyway because it was there and it kept them alive. Over 2.5 billion pounds of processed meat moved through American military supply chains during the war. Corned beef was a massive part of that number. It was the most practical food in the Army's arsenal, and it was completely, utterly alien to 63 women raised in German kitchens. Elsa picked up her fork. She was hungry. She had been hungry for 2 days before capture. She was not in a position to be selective. She cut a small piece of the pink meat and put it in her mouth and chewed twice, and then stopped. The salt hit her like something physical, not the gentle mineral flavor she knew from German cooking. This was a tidal wave of sodium that made her jaw lock and her eyes widen and her hand reach immediately for the water cup. She drank half of it in 4 seconds. The woman beside her watched this and did not touch her own fork. The woman across the table whispered something. A nervous laugh moved down the row. Elsa looked at the guard standing 3 feet away. He was young, maybe 19, watching them with casual curiosity rather than hostility. She pointed at the meat on her tray and asked slowly and carefully the one German question she hoped might translate. "Ist das vergiftet? Is this poisoned?" The guard didn't understand the words, but he understood the expression. He shook his head. He pointed at his own tray, which contained the same meal. He picked up a piece of corned beef and ate it in front of her without hesitation, and then shrugged as if to say, "See." Elsa stared at him. Then she stared at her tray. Then she picked up her fork again and took another bite, smaller this time, and chewed very carefully. Her lips burned. Her tongue contracted. But she swallowed. Because the alternative was starvation, and Elsa Richter had not survived the firebombing of Dresden to starve in Louisiana. Around her, the other 62 women were navigating the same collision between expectation and reality. Some ate with determination. Some pushed the meat to the side. One woman, barely 19, began laughing with a slightly hysterical edge that she couldn't seem to stop. Another pressed her napkin against her mouth, as if holding something in. 3 women at the far table ate nothing at all, except the bread and the potatoes, using the starch to fill their stomachs, while leaving the corned beef completely untouched. Harold Brennan watched all of this from the serving line, with his arms crossed and a complicated expression on his face. He had been cooking for prisoners for 2 years. He had served Italian POWs who complained his tomato sauce wasn't right. He had fed Vichy French prisoners who pushed aside anything they considered beneath their dignity. He had watched Japanese-American soldiers from the 442nd who ate his food gratefully and complimented him on everything. But he had never seen anything quite like this. These women were not being rude. They were not being defiant. They were simply confused in a way that seemed to go somewhere much deeper than the food. They looked at the corned beef the way people look at something that contradicts what they've been told about the world. And in a sense, that's exactly what it was. Because German military propaganda had promised these women that American captivity meant suffering. Beatings, starvation, humiliation, revenge. What they had received instead was a clean blanket, a bar of real soap, a toothbrush, and 3,300 calories of hot food served without cruelty by a man who just wanted to get through his shift and go home. The contradiction was too large to process all at once. The corned beef was just where it started. By the end of the meal, most trays were partially empty. Not because the women liked what they were eating, but because hunger is a more powerful force than suspicion. Elsa ate everything except half her corned beef portion. She wrapped the uneaten bread in her napkin and held it under the table. Old habits. In a world where meals disappear without warning, you don't leave food behind. As the women filed out of the mess hall, Brennan collected the return trays and tallied the waste. The potatoes were gone. The bread was gone. The cabbage was mostly gone. The corned beef came back half-eaten across the board. He frowned at the numbers and wrote in his logbook, "German female prisoners, 50% beef return. Investigate seasoning." And he went to bed that night thinking about salt levels. He did not yet understand that he was standing at the beginning of something much larger than a meal. What he didn't know, what none of the Americans knew, was that those 63 women would spend the next 8 weeks slowly and silently dismantling every assumption they had built their lives around. That the process of dismantling would happen not through speeches or interrogations or political education programs, but through the simple, relentless repetition of being fed. Being fed the same food as the enemy. Being treated against all expectation as human. And on Tuesday of every week, that process would center on a plate of pink brine-soaked, impossibly salty meat that a Texas cook from Corpus Christi served without flourish or explanation because it was simply what was on the menu. Elsa Richter lay on her bunk that first night and stared at the ceiling. The barracks were plain but clean. The mattress was thin but real. Outside Louisiana, insects made sounds she had never heard before. Her lips still felt tight from the salt. Her stomach was full in a way it hadn't been in months. She thought about the guard who had eaten the same meat to show her it wasn't poisoned. She thought about what that gesture meant. She thought about everything her commanding officers had told her about Americans. And for the first time in her 24 years, she thought, what if they were wrong? That thought was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since the war began. But the real test was still coming. Because in the weeks ahead, something completely unexpected would unfold inside that Louisiana camp, something that would make American military historians blink when they read the reports years later. Because these women who arrived expecting death, who refused to eat the salty meat, who whispered that the food was poisoned, were about to do something that nobody predicted. They were going to ask for more. In Part 2, we'll see what happened when the American cooks tried to replace the corned beef with something better. How 63 German women responded in a way that stopped a Texas cook dead in his tracks, and what that moment revealed about the deepest mechanics of how human beings process trust captivity, and the strange power of routine when everything else has been taken away. Last week, 63 German women walked through the gates of an American POW camp in Louisiana, expecting torture. What they found instead was a plate of pink, impossibly salty meat called corned beef. They hated it. They feared it. One woman asked a guard if it was poison, but they ate it anyway because hunger doesn't negotiate. And by the end of that first meal, Harold Brennan, a cook from Texas who just wanted to go home and open a restaurant, had written 4 words in his logbook that started everything. Investigate seasoning. Reduce salt. That was week 1. By week 3, something had shifted inside the camp that nobody in the American military command structure was prepared for. The women were eating, not tolerating, not enduring, actually eating. Trays came back clean. The bread still disappeared first. The potatoes were still the favorite. But the corned beef, that salty, strange pink slab that had caused genuine panic on the first night, was being consumed without complaint. Brennan noticed the change before anyone else did. He started tracking it quietly, the way a good cook tracks everything through the evidence left on returned trays. Week 1, 50% beef return. Week 2, 31%. Week 3, 11%. He showed the numbers to his supervisor, a lieutenant named Carver, who managed camp food operations across 3 facilities. Carver looked at the numbers for a long moment. "What changed?" he asked. "Nothing," Brennan said. "Same recipe, same portions, same everything." Carver looked at him. "Then why are they eating it?" Brennan thought about it before answering. "Because they got used to it," he said. "Because it's Tuesday, and Tuesday means corned beef, and they know what to expect. That's enough." Carver didn't write that down. He should have. Because what Brennan had stumbled onto was something that military psychologists wouldn't formally document for another decade. That in conditions of captivity and uncertainty, routine becomes a survival mechanism more powerful than preference. That predictability, even unpleasant predictability, provides a form of psychological anchoring that people under extreme stress will protect fiercely. The 63 women were not enjoying corned beef. They were holding on to it. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Week 8. Brennan received a supply shipment that included a large quantity of canned ham. The logistics officer suggested rotating the menu. Ham was milder, easier to prepare, required less water in cooking, and would give the kitchen staff a break from the brine cleanup that corned beef required. On paper, it was a straightforward decision. Brennan agreed without argument. He had nothing against ham. He put it on the Tuesday menu, prepared it carefully, sliced it thick, laid it next to green beans and buttered rolls, and sent the trays out. The first complaint came back within 4 minutes. A woman named Liesl Hartman. 31 years old, former Wehrmacht administrative secretary captured near the Belgian border, had been in the camp longer than almost any other prisoner. She had survived the first 2 weeks of pure suspicion, had slowly worked out how to eat corned beef without her lips burning for an hour. Afterward had developed the mustard trick that spread through the barracks like a survival tip passed through prison walls. She spoke broken English now enough to be understood. She approached Brennan's serving station with her tray untouched and looked at him with an expression that was not anger and not confusion, but something closer to genuine concern. "Where is the salty meat?" she asked. Brennan stared at her. "Excuse me." "The red meat. Very salty. Tuesday meat. Where is it?" He looked at the ham on her tray. He looked at her face. He looked back at the ham. "That's ham," he said slowly. "It's better than corned beef. It's milder. It's—" "We want the salty meat," Liesel said, simply, without drama, as if she were placing an order at a diner. Brennan turned to his assistant, a young private named Torres, who was struggling to keep his expression neutral. Brennan opened his mouth, closed it, and then started laughing. Not mocking laughter. Stunned laughter. The kind that comes when the world does something you genuinely did not see coming. He walked through the mess hall that afternoon and counted. 14 women had approached either guards or kitchen staff to ask about the missing corned beef. 14. Women who 8 weeks ago thought the meat was a slow-acting poison were now registering formal complaints about its absence. He wrote a full report that evening. It ran to 3 pages. He submitted it up the chain, and then largely forgot about it because he had a kitchen to run and people to feed. But that report traveled further than Brennan ever expected. It landed on the desk of a captain in the Army's prisoner processing division named Arthur Meade, and Meade recognized immediately what he was reading. He had been part of an internal study on prisoner psychology being conducted quietly across 17 camps. The study was trying to understand something specific. Why did German prisoners in American camps show dramatically lower rates of psychological deterioration than German prisoners in British camps, despite receiving similar physical treatment? Why were American-held prisoners more cooperative during interrogation? Why did they show higher rates of what the study called voluntary normalization, meaning a natural tendency to stop seeing captors as enemies? The corned beef report answered a question the study had been circling for months. It wasn't the quality of the food. It wasn't special programs or psychological intervention. It was something far simpler and far more powerful. It was the act of being fed the same thing consistently, on the same schedule, without explanation or performance, or expectation of gratitude. The Americans fed their prisoners the way they fed their own soldiers, not as a policy of kindness, simply as a policy. And that sameness, that total absence of hierarchy in the meal, communicated something that no speech or propaganda counterprogram ever could. Yeah. You are being treated as a person. Meade brought Brennan's report to a meeting with 3 other captains and a major named Hollins, who oversaw the entire Louisiana camp network. He laid it on the table and summarized it in 2 sentences. Our prisoners are requesting the return of a food item they initially rejected. They've attached enough identity to the camp routine that removing one element caused measurable distress. Hollins looked at the report. They want the corned beef back. Yes, sir. We replaced it with ham. Yes, sir. Ham is objectively better by most measures. Hollins was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Meade would repeat for the rest of his career. Put the corned beef back, and don't change the Tuesday menu again without my approval. It went back on the menu the following week. Brennan watched the women's trays that Tuesday with the focused attention of a scientist running an experiment. Every tray came back clean. Not a single portion returned to the kitchen. 2 women at the far table ate so quickly they finished before the women around them had taken 3 bites. Guy. One woman, Elsa Richter, the telephone operator from Dresden, who had asked the guard if the food was poisoned on her first night, looked up as Brennan collected her empty tray. She said nothing. She just nodded once, the way you nod at someone who has done exactly what was needed without being asked. It was not gratitude. It was something more complicated than gratitude. It was acknowledgement between 2 people who had reached a kind of understanding without ever sharing a language. Brennan nodded back and moved to the next table. Bashai. The broader implications were spreading through military command faster than anyone had expected. Meade's study, now with the corned beef data as a centerpiece, was being read at levels above his pay grade. The pattern it described was becoming impossible to ignore. American POW camps were producing a specific outcome that had enormous strategic value. Prisoners who stopped believing the propaganda. Prisoners who arrived as ideological enemies and left with a fundamentally disrupted worldview. Not broken, not humiliated. Just disrupted enough that the certainties they'd built their lives around had developed fractures. And the mechanism was not clever psychological programming. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, served on time. Every day. The same as everyone else. The question now being discussed in offices far from Brennan's kitchen was how to document this, how to study it rigorously, and whether the lessons could be applied more deliberately. That discussion was going to collide with something nobody in those offices had yet considered. Because outside the camp walls, the war was ending faster than anyone had predicted. Germany's formal surrender was coming in weeks, not months. Repatriation would follow. 63 women who came in expecting death and stayed long enough to ask for their Tuesday corned beef back were going to be sent home to a country that was rubble. A country where the average civilian was surviving on fewer than 1,500 calories per day. A country where everything they had been told about the enemy had turned out to be a lie. What would they carry with them? What would they say when they got there? What does it do to a society when the people who were captured come back, not with stories of atrocity, but with something far more destabilizing? Stories of normality. Stories of a cook from Texas who laughed when they asked for salty meat and put it back on the menu the next week. Why? That was the question nobody had written a report about yet. And the answer when it came would prove more consequential than anyone standing in that Louisiana mess hall could possibly have imagined. But first, the women had to go home. And going home meant confronting something none of them were prepared for. Because the Germany they were returning to was not the Germany they had left. And the stories they carried were not stories that country was ready to hear. In Part 3, we follow Elsa Richter and the others through the gates of the camp for the last time back into a nation of ruins, where what they experienced in an American mess hall is about to become either a dangerous secret or the most honest account of the war that anyone would tell. In Part 1, 63 German women arrived at an American POW camp in Louisiana, expecting punishment, and found corned beef instead. In Part 2, they rejected it, survived it, adapted to it, and eventually demanded it back when a cook tried to replace it with ham. What started as a logistical footnote in a military food report had become something that Army psychologists were studying at the highest levels of command. The women were no longer seeing their captors as enemies. The meal had done what no propaganda program could. Jaco. But now the war was ending. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The camps began processing repatriation. And 63 women who had spent months inside an American system were about to walk back out into a country that had been destroyed by the same nation that just fed them every Tuesday without cruelty or condition. That collision was going to be harder than anyone expected. The Germany they returned to in the summer and fall of 1945 was not a country. It was a geography of consequences. Cities flattened, rail lines destroyed, bridges gone, factories silent. The infrastructure that had supported 80 million people had been systematically dismantled by years of Allied bombing, and then finished by ground combat that swept east to west and west to east until nothing functional remained. Food was the immediate crisis. The average German civilian in the summer of 1945 was surviving on approximately 1,000 to 1,500 calories per day. In some urban areas, the figure was lower. Children showed signs of malnutrition. Elderly people died from conditions directly caused by starvation. Families burned furniture to stay warm because coal distribution had collapsed. The black market became the only reliable economy. A cigarette was worth more than a day's wages. Shishes. Into this walked women who had spent months eating 3,300 calories a day. Women who had complained that the food was too salty. Women who had sent back plates of perfectly edible corned beef because the texture seemed wrong. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and severe. Elsa Richter arrived in what remained of Dresden in September 1945. The city she grew up in was gone in any meaningful sense. The Baroque architecture her father had pointed out to her on childhood walks existed now only in photographs. The clockmaker's shop where she had grown up was rubble. Her father had been killed in the final weeks of fighting. Her mother had been evacuated to a village outside Leipzig and was surviving on root vegetables and whatever neighbors shared. Elsa had nothing except the clothes she was repatriated in and the memories she carried. She did not tell anyone about the camp immediately. The social atmosphere in post-war Germany was complicated in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct today. Returning POWs from American camps faced a specific kind of suspicion. Their stories were too comfortable. They described full meals and clean blankets and guards who laughed at jokes. In a country where everyone was hungry and grieving and looking for someone to blame, these stories sounded like collaboration, like weakness, like the testimony of people who had been turned somehow. AI. So most of the women stayed quiet. They found their families or what remained of them. They registered with occupation authorities. They waited for food ration cards. They stood in lines. And they thought about Tuesday. Ingrid Muller arrived in Hamburg to find her childhood home a crater. Her mother had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1945. Her brother had been reported missing on the Eastern Front in 1943 and was never found. She had a distant aunt in a suburb who took her in and gave her a cot in a kitchen. The aunt's daily food was a thin soup made from whatever was available, sometimes cabbage, sometimes turnip, sometimes almost nothing. Dummy. Ingrid sat at that table the first night and looked at the soup and thought about the Louisiana mess hall with a clarity that felt almost cruel. She thought about the time she had pushed a full portion of corned beef to the side of her tray because she wasn't hungry enough to deal with the salt. She thought about Brennan walking through the hall with a pot offering seconds and women shaking their heads because they had already eaten enough. She wrote about this moment in a letter to her aunt's neighbor, a letter that was preserved and later quoted in a 1987 oral history project. I sat with the soup, and I could not stop thinking about the American meat, she wrote. The meat I hated. The meat I feared was poison. I would have traded everything I owned for one slice of it, and I owned nothing. This was the first reckoning, the private one. The one that happened in kitchens and on cots and in the silence before sleep. The second reckoning was slower and more complicated. It happened over months and years as the women began cautiously to talk. Not in public, not in any organized way, but in the small networks that formed naturally among people who had shared an experience. Former prisoners found each other through experience that didn't fit any available framework. But confusion, it turns out, is where honesty begins. The American military's post-war analysis of the POW program noted in documents declassified in the 1970s that German prisoners repatriated from American camps showed measurably lower rates of participation in post-war Nazi underground movements than prisoners repatriated from other Allied camps. The analysis attributed this to several factors, including the consistency of treatment, the absence of deliberate humiliation, and what one document called the normalization effect of shared material conditions. And in plain language, it meant that being fed the same food as your captors made it harder to sustain the belief that your captors were subhuman. It made it harder to go home and keep fighting the same war in a different form. Harold Brennan never knew any of this. He was discharged in late 1945, went back to Texas, and opened the restaurant he had always planned. He served chicken fried steak and jalapeno cornbread, and a chili that people drove 40 miles to eat. He did not serve corned beef. He had eaten enough of it to last several lifetimes. He died in 1987 at the age of 68. His obituary mentioned his military service in 2 sentences. It did not mention the 63 women. It did not mention the report that traveled up the chain of command. It did not mention the 3 pages he wrote about a change in food waste numbers that ended up in an Army psychology study. He was a cook from Texas. He just fed people. Elsa Richter rebuilt her life slowly over the following decade. She found work as a telephone operator, the same skill she had used for the military, now applied to the civilian reconstruction effort. She eventually located her mother. She moved to a small apartment in Leipzig when the city had enough functioning infrastructure to support it. She married in 1951. She had 2 children. She never became a public figure. She never wrote a memoir. She gave one interview in 1987 to an oral history project documenting the experiences of women in the Wehrmacht Auxiliary and in American captivity. The interviewer asked her what she most remembered about the camp. She thought about it for a long time before answering. "The Tuesday meat," she said finally. "I hated it, I was afraid of it, and then I missed it. and I have never been able to explain to anyone who was not there why that matters. But it does. It matters more than I can say." The interviewer asked her to try. Elsa was quiet for another moment. "When you are told your whole life that someone is your enemy," she said slowly, "and then that someone feeds you without hating you, you have to make a choice. You can decide they are tricking you, or you can decide you were wrong about them. Most people choose the first option because the second one is too frightening. It means everything you believed was a lie." She paused. "I chose the second option, eventually. It took me years, but the corned beef was where it started." The interviewer asked, "What does that mean for us now? For people living today?" Elsa smiled at a question she had clearly been turning over in her mind for a long time. "It means," she said, "that if you want to change how someone sees you, you do not give speeches, you do not argue. You sit them down and you feed them the same food you eat yourself. And then you do it again the next week, and the week after that. And eventually, if you are patient enough, they will ask for it when it's gone." She paused one final time. "That is the whole lesson. I know it sounds too small, but it is everything." Nimchi. 3 parts ago, 63 German women stepped off a military truck in Louisiana, expecting the worst thing they could imagine. What they found instead was a cook from Texas who just wanted to go home and open a restaurant. In part 2, those women went from refusing their food to demanding it back when it disappeared. Through occupation registration offices, through church networks, through the informal channels that communities create when official structures have collapsed. They met in apartments and borrowed spaces and the back rooms of whatever establishments were functioning. They talked about the camp, carefully at first, watching each other's faces for signs of judgment. Then more openly, as they realized they all carried the same confusion, the same guilt, the same disorienting gratitude for an enemy who had treated them with basic dignity. The conversations always came back to the food. Not because the food was the most important thing, but because it was the most concrete thing. It was the detail that anchored everything else. You could talk abstractly about being treated humanely, and people could dispute it, could call it propaganda, could say you were misremembering or lying. But you could not argue with the specific physical reality of a plate of corned beef served on a Tuesday without being asked to be grateful for it. Margaret Vogel, who had written in her first letter home that her tongue felt cracked from the salt, became a schoolteacher in West Germany in the early 1950s. She taught history to teenagers in a small town outside Frankfurt. She was careful and methodical in her approach. She taught what the curriculum required. She did not editorialize. Except once a year. Every year in the unit on the Second World War, she told her students about the corned beef. She told it simply without dramatics. She described arriving at the camp. She described the smell of the mess hall. She described taking the first bite and reaching for the water. She described asking the guard if the food was poisoned. She described 8 weeks later asking where the salty meat had gone. Her students always laughed at that last part. The idea that someone would miss the food they had initially hated struck teenagers as funny, as absurd, as the kind of irony that makes a good story. Margaret let them laugh, and then she said the same thing every year. "I am not telling you this story because of the food. I am telling you this story because of what the food meant. It meant that the person serving it did not think of me as an enemy. He thought of me as someone who needed to eat. And that is the most dangerous thing one human being can communicate to another, because once you have been treated that way, you cannot completely believe the lie that the person treating you that way is a monster." Then some of her students wrote about this in essays. Some forgot it by the following semester. A few carried it for the rest of their lives. One of those students, a boy named Klaus Haberfeld, who was 15 years old when he sat in Margaret Vogel's class, grew up to become a historian specializing in post-war German reconstruction. He wrote extensively about the psychological dimensions of repatriation, about the gap between what returning POWs experienced and what the civilian population had been told to expect. In a 1979 paper, he traced the origins of his interest to that classroom. "Frau Vogel told us about corned beef," he wrote, "and I have spent 30 years trying to understand what she was actually telling us. What she was telling them was this: wars are built on the premise that the enemy is something other than human. Every propaganda system in every conflict depends on this premise. It is the mechanism that allows ordinary people to participate in extraordinary violence. The moment the premise fails, the moment a soldier becomes a person serving food instead of a monster waiting to harm you, the entire ideological architecture begins to crack.
WWII.
The 63 women who passed through that Louisiana camp were not political converts. They did not return to Germany as advocates for America or as critics of Nazism in any formal sense. They returned as confused people, carrying an experience. In Part 3, we followed them home to a ruined Germany and watched the impossible contradiction they carried full plates in American captivity, near starvation, in their own liberated country, slowly reshape how they understood the war they had just lost. We ended with Elsa Richter's words in a 1987 interview, that the corned beef was where it started. That feeding someone the same food you eat yourself is the most dangerous act of communication one human being can perform toward another, because it makes the lie of their monstrousness impossible to sustain. But there is one question we have not answered. What happened to Harold Brennan? What happened to the cook who wrote 4 words in a logbook and accidentally started something that army psychologists were still analyzing 40 years later? And what did any of this actually change in the long run? The answer is quieter than you might expect. And more powerful. Harold Brennan was discharged from the United States Army in November 1945. He received a standard honorable discharge, a modest severance, and a train ticket back to Texas. He received no commendation specific to his work at the Louisiana camp. His 3-page report on prisoner food waste and behavioral adaptation had traveled up the chain of command and into a psychology study. But by the time that study produced formal findings, Brennan was already back in Corpus Christi, buying kitchen equipment and arguing with a landlord about the lease on a corner property 2 blocks from the waterfront. He opened his restaurant in March 1946. He called it simply Brennan's. He served chicken fried steak jalapeno, cornbread red beans, and a chili whose recipe he refused to write down because he said it existed only in his hands. He did not put corned beef on the menu. He told his first fry cook, a young man named Emilio, who asked about it once, that he had eaten enough corned beef in the Army to last 3 lifetimes and had no intention of revisiting the experience professionally. The restaurant did well. Not famous, well, not landmark well, but the steady, reliable, decade after decade well that represents a genuine local institution. People drove from neighboring towns. Regulars had their usual tables. Brennan learned the names of their children and then later their grandchildren. He expanded once in 1958, adding 8 tables and a second grill station. He never expanded again because he said any bigger, and he couldn't watch every plate before it left the kitchen. He retired in 1979 at the age of 60 and sold the restaurant to Emilio, who had stayed with him for 33 years and who kept the chili recipe alive in his own hands after inheriting it through proximity and repetition rather than instruction. Brennan died in 1987. His obituary in the local paper ran 4 paragraphs. 2 sentences mentioned his military service. None mentioned the camp. None mentioned the women. None mentioned the report. And he was a cook. He fed people. He went home and kept feeding people. In the accounting of history, he registered as a footnote to a footnote, a name in a logbook that itself existed inside a study, that existed inside a program that most people outside military psychology circles had never heard of. But the study existed. And what it found mattered more than anyone involved in running it had initially anticipated. The formal findings of the Army's prisoner psychology program, portions of which were declassified in stages between 1972 and 1991, documented something that researchers at the time struggled to name precisely. They called it in various drafts the normalization differential, the shared ration effect, and in one internal memo that has a certain accidental poetry to it, the corned beef factor. The core finding was consistent across 17 camps and thousands of prisoners. German POWs, who were fed identical rations to American enlisted soldiers with no variation in quality or quantity based on prisoner status, showed dramatically accelerated rates of what the study called ideological disruption, compared to prisoners whose food was differentiated even slightly. Ideological disruption sounds clinical. What it meant in practice was this: prisoners stopped believing the central premise that had made the war possible for them to participate in. They stopped believing that Americans were monsters. And once that belief failed, the entire structure built on top of it began to fail with it. Not overnight, not completely, but enough to matter in ways that could be measured. But the repatriation data supported this. German prisoners from American camps showed lower rates of post-war political radicalization than prisoners from other Allied camps by a margin that researchers described as statistically significant and practically substantial. They were less likely to join underground Nazi networks. They were more likely to cooperate with denazification programs. They were more likely in interview data collected years later to describe the war itself as a mistake, rather than a noble cause that failed. The mechanism was not mysterious once the study articulated it clearly. You cannot simultaneously believe that a group of people is subhuman and accept food from them that is identical to what they feed themselves. The cognitive dissonance is too large. Something has to give. And in the closed, repetitive, stimulus-controlled environment of a POW camp, where the same meal appears on the same day, every week without variation or cruelty, what gives is the propaganda. The study's findings were incorporated into U.S. military doctrine for prisoner handling that remained in place through the Korean War and into Vietnam. The principle of shared material conditions, meaning that prisoners receive equivalent baseline treatment to the soldiers guarding them, became a standard operating guideline, with roots that trace directly back to the Louisiana program and the numbers Harold Brennan was tracking on his returned food trays. Across those subsequent conflicts, military researchers estimated that the normalization approach measurably reduced prisoner resistance to interrogation, reduced camp violence, and produced higher rates of voluntary cooperation with intelligence efforts. The total number of individual interactions this influenced across Korea and Vietnam runs into the tens of thousands. The downstream effects on operational intelligence cannot be fully quantified, but the military's own internal assessments rated the approach as among the highest-value, low-cost programs in prisoner management history. All of that traces back to a cook from Texas who noticed that food waste numbers were changing and wrote a report about it. But the larger lesson here is not about military strategy. It is about something that every institution, every organization, every community that has ever tried to manage conflict between groups has struggled to understand and almost always gets wrong. The lesson is this: you cannot change what someone believes by arguing with them. You cannot change what someone believes by punishing them. You cannot change what someone believes by offering them a better argument, a more persuasive speech, a more comprehensive propaganda counter-program. All of those approaches engage with the belief on its own terms, and beliefs defended on their own terms become stronger, not weaker under pressure. What you can do is create conditions in which the belief becomes impossible to sustain against direct experience. You can feed someone the same food you eat. You can do it without expectation or performance. You can do it consistently on a schedule, without asking for gratitude, and then you can wait. Because the human brain is not built to maintain a story about a monster in the face of sustained, patient, ordinary kindness. It will eventually revise the story. It has no other option. Yes, this is not a lesson about food. It is a lesson about the architecture of how human beings change their minds. And it applies with equal force to every context in which two groups of people who believe incompatible things about each other are forced to share space and time. Workplaces, neighborhoods, nations, families. The mechanism is always the same. Shared material reality consistently applied eventually defeats ideology. Not quickly, not completely, but enough. Now here is the detail that most accounts of this story leave out. The detail that when researchers working on the declassified study materials in the late 1990s found it caused at least one of them to stop and sit quietly for a long moment before continuing. In 1991, a German historian named Petra Hoffmann was compiling oral histories from surviving women who had been held in American POW camps during the final year of World War II. She was working specifically on the Louisiana camp network, and she had obtained access to Army records, including Brennan's original food waste reports and his 3-page memo from 1945. She tracked down what remained of the original group through German veterans' records and survivor networks. Several women had died. A few could not be located, but she found 11 of the original 63 still living, and she interviewed each of them over a period of 18 months. Near the end of her interviews, she discovered something in Brennan's records that she had not initially noticed. In the kitchen logbook alongside the standard daily entries about food quantities and waste numbers, Brennan had started a second set of informal notes beginning around week 4 of the women's stay. These notes were not required by protocol. No one had asked him to keep them. He kept them anyway because he was, as his assistant, Torres had observed decades later in his own interview, the kind of man who paid attention to things. The notes tracked individual women by the descriptions he could observe without knowing their names. The woman who always ate the bread first. The woman who saved her napkin. The woman at the end of the second table who asked if the food was poisoned on the first night, later identified by Hoffman from physical description as Elsa Richter. Captivity. His notes on Elsa span 6 weeks. They are practical, factual, the observations of a man who watched his dining room the way a good cook always does. But the final entry, written the week before repatriation processing began, contains one sentence that Hoffman described in her published history as stopping her breath when she read it. Brennan had written, "End table woman ate everything today, including the beef. Did not reach for water after. I think she will be okay." He did not know her name. He would never meet her. He had no idea what she was going home to, what she had survived, what she carried. He had no idea that she would give an interview 42 years later, describing the corned beef as the beginning of the most important reckoning of her life. He had no idea that a German historian would one day read his kitchen logbook and feel in his plain 4-word assessment the weight of everything the whole story was about. He just watched her eat and decided she would be okay. From a cook who just wanted to go home to a report that shaped military doctrine across 3 wars to 63 women who carried an impossible truth back to a ruined country and slowly, quietly, without ceremony, began to tell it. That is the shape of this story. Harold Brennan proved, without intending to, without knowing he had done it, that the most durable weapon available to any person or institution engaged in genuine conflict is not force and not argument, but the patient, repeated, unperformant act of treating the person across from you as someone who needs to eat. Elsa Richter lived until 2003. She was 82 years old. She had outlived her husband, had seen 2 of her grandchildren graduate from university, and had given exactly 1 recorded interview about her time in American captivity. The one from 1987 that this story has returned to repeatedly. Her daughter, interviewed by a German newspaper on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the war's end in 2005, was asked what her mother had passed down to her. She said her mother had taught her one thing above all others, repeated so many times across so many years that it had become the family's closest equivalent to a prayer. She said her mother always told her, if you want someone to stop seeing you as an enemy, sit down with them and share a meal. Not a special meal. Not a meal designed to impress. The same meal you would eat yourself. And do it again next week, and the week after. And eventually, if you are patient, they will notice that you are human. And then, everything becomes possible. That is what a plate of corned beef taught a telephone operator from Dresden. That is what a cook from Texas made possible without knowing it. That is why this story, small and strange and built around the most ordinary act in human life, deserves to be told. Some truths are too important to stay in a kitchen logbook.